The remarkable thing about Romensky is that all of this is completely spontaneous.
Right.
So once he gets over the wall, he's got no plan, he's got no money, he's got no idea where he's going to go. His whole thing is about escaping from the prison, and once he's escaped, then whatever happens to him, happens to him. He just literally runs off. Tragically, Johnny Ramensky had a very, very sad end, and he was mythologised. I mean, there was folk songs written about him. There was a Hollywood film written about him.
Tom, thanks for coming through again. Great to see you.
See you.
Yeah. Today, I was narrating a story you wrote and loved it, by the way, Gentle Johnny Ramensky, the legendary. And it's a fascinating story. I just wanted to pick your brains a wee bit for everyone that's going to hear it and get some of the background, because it raises so many issues and it transports us back to a different time entirely, when the skill set for criminals was much different than it is today. Tell us how Gentle Johnny Ramensky came to be a story. How did you find out about him?
Johnny Ramensky, the famous safe breaker, prison escaper, sort of local, almost a Robin Hood figure back in the post-war Scotland. He was one of the most famous men. He was well known, well regarded, pictures all over the newspapers. Gentle Johnny Ramensky, famous because he was a cheeky chappy, successful criminal, outwitted the authorities, but was non-violent. Right. And so the tabloid press very much focused on that aspect of him. And all that was true, but there was so much more to Johnny Ramensky. And like all the stories I write, I like to dig below the surface and actually bring out the real person with all its nuances. And Johnny Ramensky is a fascinating character. You
mentioned some of his CV there, if you like, the safe-blowing prison escape. What was his background then? How did he come to be Johnny Ramensky? Where did he come from?
Well, Johnny Ramensky was actually Johannes Romenskus. He was a Lithuanian boy, born in Lanarkshire, and there was quite a lot of Lithuanian miners came across, not to mine coal, to mine clay in Lanarkshire. And he was born in Scotland to a Lithuanian family. And before he was, 10, 11 years old, he was working down the mines, helping his father. And of course, one of the things about miners was that they were using explosives. And so Johnny quickly picked up a technical proficiency in explosives. And you find that when you look at the crime going through the 1950s, 1960s, an awful lot of the criminals then were very technically adept.
This is transferable skills.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yes. So Johnny Ramensky, his father dies when he's very young, and he moves from the very protected area of Lanarkshire, and the community round about him, they moved to the Gorbals, dropped in the deep end there. And very hard for a young man like Johnny to stay away from the gangs and from crime. Hard for anyone at that time. This is in the immediate sort of the early 1930s. Okay. Very, very difficult time, razor gangs, etc., etc. This is before Percy Sillitoe, the reforming Chief Constable of Glasgow, really cracks down on it. And there's a great story to him too, of course. Anyway, Romensky becomes a burglar, but he is physically gifted. Romensky is built like an acrobat. When you look at photographs of him, you see a very small framed man with incredible upper body strength. Okay. He's like a gymnast. And so he becomes a climber, and he has no fear of heights, and he's able to scale drain pipes, road pipes, 30, 40, 50 feet with absolute ease, almost ape-like in his dexterity, tremendous strength and agility. I mean, he could have been an acrobat. He could have been a circus acrobat or a trapeze artist. That was the sort of strength he had.
Something that comes across in the story is that could have been, and that's quite often the case with criminals. I remember as a cop, we used to say, if that guy would apply himself to something productive, to something honest, then he could be a success at anything he wanted to be. And that's very true of Johnny, and later he gets the chance to do that. But he proves that being a criminal is a life choice as well sometimes.
It is, but by that time also, Johnny had become a celebrity. And I think his decision not to take up a sort of a lawful life was to do with his celebrity. You see it now all the time, modern celebrities, and they destroy themselves in order to keep in the front page and keep it. Yes, that's right. In some respects, that's what Johnny Ramensky did. He would not and could not give up the limelight and give up the image of himself.
And that image and that limelight was greatly born from his repeated escapes from places that nobody had ever escaped from before. Tell us a bit about that. And what I love is how he was so adept at it, but had no plan or provision for having his.
Yes, I mean, this all surrounds Johnny's relationship with Peterhead Prison. Now, Peterhead Prison in the northeast of Scotland
which was a secure prison.
Very, very high security prison. And in fact, before it was a Victorian jail, but before Romensky's escapes, no one had escaped from Peterhead before. Enormously high walls, and Peterhead is stuck on a peninsula with the sea on one side and barren landscape, farmland on the other side. And of course, any time from autumn through to spring, it's also bitterly cold and inhospitable. So Romensky is put there because he's escaped from prison before, and because he's a serious offender now, he's broken into several places. He's getting 5-year sentences now in the High Court. They put him to Peterhead, and he sees Peterhead Prison as a challenge. And he escaped from Peterhead on no less than 4 occasions. On one occasion, he escaped 3 times in 1 year. He is incredibly nimble, so if he's out on the exercise yard at all he needs is a brief second or a minute when he's not under observations, and he's off. And he can scale a wall, almost like you see a lizard would scale a wall. He can climb up the corners by pressing his back into the corner of a wall and then shin up using the strength of his legs. Enormous upper body strength, but no weight. So the power to weight ratio is incredible. In one of his most notable escapes, he shins up the wall and then gets on the other side of the wall and hangs by his hands off the other side of the wall for about half an hour before dropping down.
Waiting for what's going on underneath him. A dreepy, we used to call that.
Yes, that's right, a dreepy. Waiting for the coast to clear, and down he goes. But the remarkable thing about Romensky is that all of this is completely spontaneous.
Right.
So once he gets over the wall, he's got no plan, he's got no money, he's got no idea where he's going to go. His whole thing is about escaping from the prison. And once he's escaped, then whatever happens to him, happens to him. Yeah. He just literally runs off. And there's the famous case, the case that really made his name in 1934, bitterly, bitterly cold. He got over the wall, has a light pair of shoes on. On one occasion, he had no shoes on, a light jacket, battle dress jacket, freezing cold, and he makes off, heads off south, across the farmland, and he comes to this bridge, long road bridge, over the River Eithne, just outside the town of Ellen. Right? And the police are there, and they're looking for him, and they've blocked both sides of the bridge. They know which way he's heading, and he's got across this bridge. And so the water is running in flood. There's ice on the river. By this time, he's already been out for several hours. He's cold and he's hungry. It's dark. But he manages to climb hand over hand under the bridge. Now, one slip and he was dead. Hand over hand under the bridge over the Eithne, and makes good his escape. And of course, even now, I've been at that bridge and I've looked at that bridge. It's remarkable. It's inconceivable anybody could do that. When you consider he did it in the dark of the night,
no equipment,
in the cold of winter, when he was already tired,
totally inadequate
and hungry. Absolutely, it just shows the enormous ability that man had. So he makes his escape. But classically, with Romensky, is he's captured a couple of days later, starving, hungry, cold, suffering.
Probably a relief to get captured.
Well, in fact, he joked. What gave him the name Gentle Johnny was he never put up a fight when he was arrested.
Right.
And in fact, he used to joke with the prison officers. And probably the reason he joked with them was because they'd saved his life.
Yes.
Because the truth of the matter was that nobody could survive out in the open without any kind of protective clothing at that time of the year.
And he was helping with security measures and whatnot. He was teaching them how to secure the prison.
The police in Aberdeenshire got really good at hunting people, and a lot of them actually built up a grudging relationship with Johnny Ramensky over the years. But the funny thing was that the number of times he escaped from Peterhead, He always escaped in the same way, and he always made off in the same way, and he was always arrested more or less in the same place, in the same circumstances.
Yeah.
But that wasn't important, because in the mind of Johnny Ramensky, the thing was he had overcome the security of the prison. That was the challenge. The challenge was not to make good his escape. No. The challenge was to escape.
And because of that relationship with the police who were dealing with him, locking him up in the first place for his crimes, and his modus operandi, if you like, his MO of the climbing would stand out a mile. I had things like that throughout my career, where the MO narrowed it down immediately to a select few that would be capable of such a thing, or had a trademark, if you like. Climbing was a big one, of drain pipes and whatnot, right, and getting through small spaces. Sometimes people could get through tiny spaces, and you knew who had done it because of that. And immediately you check to see if they're in prison or not. And if they're not in prison, you know where your next port of call is. Yeah.
Well, Romensky was like that. Romensky's MO, the daring climbs, the heights he climbed, the scaling of roofs, the method of entry, the use of gelignite in the way he did it, it was like leaving a fingerprint. Yeah. And so the more famous he became, the more unsuccessful he became.
Yes. And he spent the majority of his life in prison, didn't he?
Tragically, he spent over 40 years of his life in prison.
But during that period, we went to war, and his skills were harnessed. Do you believe they were harnessed? Do we know they were harnessed?
Yes, we can be certain. There's a lot of mythology around about Johnny Ramensky's war service, that he won the military medal for gallantry and whatnot, and that he broke into safes in Germany and stole
secret papers,
Hitler's papers, all that. A lot of that's not true. But what is true is that at the outset of the war, he wrote to Superintendent John Westland, who was the long-serving detective super in the Grampian police, or the old Aberdeen police, who Ramensky knew well. Westland was a fly character, and Westland realised that he'd be doing business with Johnny Ramensky, so made sure all these junior detectives knew who he was. So Westland, when Ramensky got out from prison, Westland would say, come and see me, Johnny, before you head back to Glasgow, whatever.
This is when he got out the door, not when he got out over the wall.
Well, so he got out the door, and he was released. So he would come down to Westland's office, and Westland would give him a cup of tea and a chat. And in the interim, a whole lot of junior detectives would come in and say, "Hi, boss." And say, "Oh, this is Johnny." And what he was actually doing was he was introducing his men to someone who he knew full well they would be hunting eventually. At the outbreak of war, Ramensky wrote to Westland. He was a great letter writer, John Ramensky. It was all he could do in prison. He wrote to Westland and said that he thought that his skill set would be useful for the war
volunteered, right?
And Westland thought about this and thought, well, actually, he could be right, but also, if he's away doing something for the war effort, he's not causing me trouble. Westland somehow pulled some strings, and the day that Romensky was released from prison, he was signed up to the Royal Fusiliers, which is an English regiment, but that was just an administrative convenience. Yeah. He was immediately posted to 30 Commando and sent for commando training. Now, of course, if ever there was a duck to water, Romensky in commando training,
course and all these things,
climbing, agility, strength,
explosives,
everything. I mean, he was a born commando. Yeah. And it's interesting because by that time, Romensky was well into his 30s, and he was training with 18, 19-year-old boys. But everybody who trained or served with Johnny Ramensky said he had the most incredible physique. Yeah. Not just strength, but also durability. Mm-hmm. He was a machine, you know. So anyway, the 30 Commando were sent out to Italy, and their job was to, as the Allied forces were going north, 30 Commando went ahead of them to prepare the ground for the advancing forces. That was Ramensky's war.
That was right up his street, wasn't it? Did he win any medals, or was he recognised?
He didn't, because his discipline was still poor. And a really funny incident where John Westland is in his office in Aberdeen, and he gets a package from Italy, and it's from Johnny Ramensky, a very expensive wristwatch.
He'd stolen. Yeah. Presumably. He didn't buy it anyway, that's for sure.
And the governor of Peterhead Prison, with whom Johnny had this sort of relationship, he gets a beautiful hand-tooled leather wallet, which of course is hugely embarrassing. But of course, Johnny Ramensky knows this. What Ramensky's doing is he's never saying, "I'm still here. Don't forget me. I'm still here. And here and I am here to challenge you. And here's another challenge. What are you going to do with this watch?
What I love about that, Tom, is that relationship between not so much the governor, because that's not up my street, but the senior detective nurturing him and forming that relationship with him. Because there's no other word for it. He had a relationship with him,
Yeah, that's right.
and a rapport with him.
He had a very long relationship with a famous Glasgow detective called Bob Cahoon, who you see a lot in historical data. He was one of the famous heads of Glasgow CID. One time when Bob Cahoon fell ill, Romensky obviously heard about it and wrote him a letter from Peterhead and said he wished him a full recovery and hoped that his activities had not contributed to Mr. Cahoon's ill health.
He had a touch of class about him, didn't he? In your career, Tom, did you ever, you were a long time in the CID at various ranks and investigating officer, did you ever have a criminal like that you had a grudging respect for? Maybe you would never tell him that. I wouldn't imagine you would. But someone that you looked at and thought, if he could supply himself elsewhere.
There was many. There was quite a few I had a grudging respect for, but there was one or two others that I just liked.
Right.
I just liked.
Yeah.
As a young detective down working in some of the big housing schemes, there was these laddies came in and they were just inveterate little thieves. But you know what? They were quite good at planning. They were courageous. They carried through their plans, and it was awful because I thought, if only you had put that skill set into it. There was one, I remember one wee guy, and I'll not mention his name because he's
still alive?
No, he's not alive, actually. He hung himself in prison, and that was the tragedy of it. But he used to come in, and he was a terrible thief. And we'd had him into the CID office, and we did to question him. And he said, at the end of the day, as we're leaning through the cells, he says, you know something? He says, I love coming in to see you guys. I said, why is that? Why is that, Frankie? And it was Frankie. Why is that, Frankie? He says, because you guys speak to me.
Yeah.
And I've often thought about that. That we were the only people that took an interest in that boy.
Yeah.
Not funny. We were trying to solve crimes.
Yeah.
But actually, we were the only people who paid a blind bit of notice to that laddie.
So the word I used unwittingly was relationship.
Yeah.
But in a lot of cases, that's what they were seeking, was some kind of relationship, some kind of human contact.
So it was.
Because they'd never had that in their upbringing.
This wee laddie, I mean, he was such a bad thief. He would actually steal shoes from the display things outside shoe shops at that time. And you'd see him walking down the road with a different right and left shoe. It was not clever, but there was something very, very sad about it. And I kept an eye on him. I kept track of him. But of course, as he got older, he started getting prison sentences. And then eventually he hanged himself in prison. I've never forgotten that.
That's a subject we're going to come back to time and time again, isn't it? The historical cases that we've dealt with. Back to Johnny, to round off with Gentle Johnny. The celebrity then became the thing because he had choices then. He was given a choice to go straight. At
the end of the war, he could have become an interpreter because he was fluent in Lithuanian, which is part Russian. And so he could have become an interpreter in occupied Germany and stayed in the army, which he thoroughly enjoyed.
Yeah.
But he decided he had to come back, and he took up his life of crime again. But of course, as he got older, he wasn't as proficient.
Yeah. That skill set was very much dependent on his athleticism, wasn't it?
He started to pick up injuries, and he was so well known.
Yes.
Anytime there was a safe blown on the 4th floor, it was Johnny. And he was arrested regularly, started to get very long terms of imprisonment. Prison is not good for your health, and poor diet, etc. His health started to suffer. So tragically, Johnny Ramensky had a very, very sad end, and he was mythologized. I mean, there was folk songs written about him. There was a Hollywood film written about him. But that was all about the myth of Johnny Ramensky, not about the man.
Yeah.
The man is actually a lot more complex and a lot more interesting than the myth.
And now we can say we've added to that folklore because he's going to feature in your new book that we'll talk about again. What's it going to be called, or working title?
It's a collection of stories, and the working title is Sex, Spies and Bloody Murder, Stories from Scotland's Underbelly, Volume 1.
Can't wait. So we're going to add Johnny's story to that, adding to the legend. And now a podcast. We've brought Johnny right up to modern day.
He deserves to be remembered, but he deserves to be remembered in 360 degrees, not simply as the tabloid headline.
The Escapades.
Because actually, he's a very, very interesting character. And he was another victim of the cult of celebrity, which is so common today.
And what comes round full circle is that he was an immigrant from an immigrant family.
Yes.
And the problems that he had in the Gorbals, his Catholicism, etc., are mirrored very much in the modern day as well.
That is the thing about a lot of these stories, whether you're talking about the early 20th century or the 19th century, the lessons trip down through the ages and they're still as relevant. Today you can say, oh, wait a minute, that's such and such. So.
Brilliant, Tom. Thanks very much for sharing.
Thank you.
Next time on Crime Time Inc.
I discovered Violet Van Der Elst by mistake. I was researching in my book on the Ruxton murders. There was a fleeting reference to Violet Van Der Elst, and I thought, who is this woman? And the more I dug into it, the more I became fascinated, because she's one of these people who has been written out of history. She was driven by this absolute abhorrence of judicial murder, of hanging, of the death penalty, and she set out on a campaign to try and get it eradicated. There's no blue plaque, there's no monument, there's no statue to Violet Van Der Elst. What she did was she confronted authority. This little old lady in the Rolls Royce lambasting the policeman or lambasting the Home Secretary or the judge. Of course, that appealed to, a lot of ordinary people who thought, good on you, girl, go on.